Hi everybody. Hi, this time. Hi. I prepared like Miss Kara's winter reading list, and the winter vacation is coming, so I thought that maybe recommending some books to a student is a good thing to do. And you guys know our Miss Kara Lairson, the IB English teacher, and I asked her again this time for making a recommendation for a winter book reading list, and she was kind enough to make a recommendation for our students. So, Ms. Kara, would you like to say hi to our student, please?
Hi.
Thank you.
Um, yeah. Hi. I actually, one of the things about this reading list, Mr. Shin mentioned that he would really like it if some of the reading list actually came from a recommended reading list for the AP Literature and Composition test. So actually, all four of these pieces of reading material, I'll just go ahead and say reading material, actually come from a subscribed reading list for the AP literature exam. And all four of the selections that I've chosen have actually appeared more than once on the AP literature exam since 2003. So these four are, in my opinion, not just great um, pieces of literature to read, but they're also important and also highly valuable if you plan on taking the AP literature exam. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Kara.
Of course.
So here's your first book. So, would you like to make an introduction of your first book, please?
Yeah, so the first selection that I chose is actually a play called Othello by Shakespeare. You've probably heard of it. And actually, Othello is my favorite Shakespeare play. It's one of his tragedies. And it centers on a king named Othello, and he is embroiled in this sort of cat and mouse game with who he thinks is a very trustworthy right hand man named Iago. And so the whole play is about this sort of interaction between him and Iago, and it involves his wife Desdemona. And it's just a really, really good play. Um, Especially if you're like me and you really like reading about jealousy and tragedy. So it's, in my opinion, it's probably. I don't want to say the most interesting because I love all of Shakespeare's work, but for me, it's definitely the most interesting to read, and it's also a really, really good introduction to Shakespeare. If you've
Mm,
never read any Shakespeare before, I find Othello to be accessible because it does revolve around the themes of jealousy, because it does revolve around love and betrayal. And I just find that people are much more interested in those themes than others.
okay, I have a question, Ms. Kara.
Yeah.
Actually, with my first grade student, I did a 12th night this semester, which is a comedy.
Yeah.
I also liked Shakespeare, and before I studied Shakespeare's tragedy first. Then now I study like a comedy of Shakespeare. So
Mm.
I nowadays it seems that I prefer comedy than tragedy of Shakespeare. So honestly, when you gave me the Othello as your first pick, it was quite surprising. I mean, it was really like, I mean, why
Well,
Othello? I mean, why did you? Is there any reason why you chose Othello as your first pick, or?
um, my Shakespeare class actually in university only focused on the four tragedies.
Mm,
But Othello has also been made into like modern day adaptations. There's one called O. Um, but I just find I really, really just enjoy reading
mm,
tragedies.
okay.
And Othello is one of the most tragic.
Mm,
And it really does revolve around this idea of who do you trust? Who do
mm,
you believe? Do
mm,
you believe someone that you love? Do you believe someone who is supposed to be, your advisor?
okay.
Who do you follow?
Mm,
And Othello is caught in the middle of that.
mm,
And I just find him to be a very interesting, sort of complex character because you do find him in these situations where he is, just sort of torn about who to believe and who to trust. But
mm,
inevitably, as most of us would find, most of us human beings, jealousy is a really powerful emotion,
mm.
and it really sort of pushes us to
Oh, Kara, can you hear me? It seems that our computer stopped. I can hear you.
On Earth has experienced jealousy before. And
Mm,
so in some way we can find ways to relate to Othello, whether it be jealousy of, someone getting the attention of someone that we care about, or
mm,
jealousy of someone being more successful,
mm.
than we are. And so I just find Othello to be more relatable, I
Okay.
guess, than some
Um,
Shakespearean plays.
as a matter of fact, with all things going on in around the world nowadays, like COVID virus and like some kind of racism, and
Mm.
I'm trying to be like a politically neutral, but I thought that I guess like maybe like Miss Cara chose this Othello because it reflects the current reality of nowadays, what's going on between the race and stuff.
Also it does have a lot to do um with that as well.
Mm.
And actually, I think all four of the
Right,
pieces that I
right,
chose sort of relate in some way
exactly.
to the world at large right now and hold
Yes,
some relevance. And
right,
I think that that's one of the reasons why Shakespeare is so incredible, is because you can still find relevance
right,
to social issues in
right,
plays that were written, in the
right,
15 and 1600s.
right, exactly,
So,
right.
yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
But I really, really just in a very biased way love Othello. It is my favorite. So,
Mm.
I'm just a big fan of tragedies and really
Okay.
sad movies. So,
Mm.
it's sort of
Okay.
natural that I would choose one of the saddest, in
Mm.
my opinion, one of the saddest and most tragedy-stricken
Mm.
plays that Shakespeare wrote.
So
So,
your favorite character from Othello is, of course, should be Othello or any other character?
it's
Who is
actually the bad guy. It's actually Iago.
Iago? Iago is your
Yeah.
favorite character?
Yeah, it's actually Iago. But I have like a soft spot for the bad characters. Um,
Really?
yeah, I mean, even in Harry Potter, like I loved Draco Malfoy, from like so. But I think Iago, because he is so complex and because he is driven by
Mm, mm,
these very base id desires, he wants what he wants.
mm.
And whoever's lives he tears apart, it doesn't matter as long as he gets what he wants. And I think
Mm,
he's just a really complex, sort of layered
right.
character.
Mm,
And you really feel for Othello, and you yell at I found myself yelling when I was
mm.
reading Othello for the first time, just like, no, Othello, don't listen to him. But Iago was such a convincing character.
Mm,
And you find yourself wondering, how easily could I be convinced if someone that I believed was on my side was
mm,
feeding me all of this information that wasn't true.
mm.
So but yeah, Iago's my favorite character.
Okay, okay, good to know. Wow, I thought it might be Othello, but I guess you chose Iago. Okay.
Yeah,
And uh, one last question
of
about
course.
Othello. I guess you are not very satisfied with the description of Desdemona in Othello. That's a woman as a like a passive role only, and
Yeah, I feel like in Othello, Desdemona does take on a very sort of passive. She becomes the focus of, Iago's betrayal and Othello's rage.
mm,
And so she doesn't really, in my mind, she doesn't really have her own sort of, I don't want to say personality, because
mm,
Shakespeare definitely did give her a personality.
mm,
But she's definitely there to serve as like the centerpiece for betrayal versus
mm,
distrust, in your significant other, in your spouse.
mm.
Um, I think Desdemona, again, is a very interesting character, but definitely not the reason that I would read Othello.
Okay.
Like she's not the main reason that I would read Othello.
Mm, mm, mm. So, well, I just have one last question.
Okay.
Speaking of description of Desdemona, overall in Shakespeare's drama, Shakespeare is really like patriarchal person. Like man is here and woman is here, very traditional and
Mhm.
man-centered, like order and hegemony. So I guess I maybe like a woman reading the Shakespeare's play or drama might have like some kind of I might not like idea of Shakespeare, and you still chose Shakespeare as your favorite dramatist. What do you
I
think?
think So I think for me, I have to remember the time that Shakespeare was writing in. I have
Mm,
to remember the sort of era of Shakespeare and how even when
okay.
Shakespeare was a playwright, women weren't even allowed to
Mm,
be in the
right.
productions. It was all
Exactly.
men.
Mm,
And so, Shakespeare is writing what he knows
mm,
in the current time. But I
okay.
also still find to be some of Shakespeare's work pretty progressive in the way that he does
Oh,
write
really?
women.
Oh, wow.
Um, I
Really?
do. I mean, if you
Oh.
think about, like, obviously, if you think about something like Romeo and Juliet, for
Mm,
example, which, is again another tragedy. But if you think about Romeo and Juliet and you think about Juliet going against her family, sort of
oh,
rebuking the laws
okay.
of her
Okay.
family, if you look at it in that
Mm,
lens, then I think
okay.
that, she didn't follow the status quo of her family. Her family
Mm,
name didn't mean anything to her, even though
mm,
it was a wealthy family,
sure.
and this could be reading too deeply into Romeo and Juliet,
Mm,
but
okay.
I do think that Shakespeare did have a lot of progressive elements in his plays in regards to women.
Mm,
However, I would agree with you that it's still very written in a very sort of
right.
uh, a very patriarchal structure.
Mm,
But again, looking at the time that things were written and the expectations of women when things we know when Shakespeare was writing, he was writing what he knew.
mm,
And he was
okay.
writing for a society that would only be so accepting
Mm,
of the things that he had to say, or
mm,
of the if he didn't write plays that people wanted to put on, he didn't eat. And so there is a sort of catering to the era and the time that you're living in, but I do think that a lot of Shakespeare's ideas and some of his characters were pretty progressive for the era that he was writing in.
okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So I guess we should moving on to next book, shall we?
Okay.
Next book is Great Gatsby. So would you like to introduce your opinion, please?
Yeah, so The Great Gatsby was written in 1925 by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Probably one of the most common books that you will see on like a high
Mm,
school reading list
mm,
anywhere that you look.
mm,
I actually think that Mr. Georgie had his students read The Great Gatsby
mm,
at one point, just because it's so intricate, not intricate. Oh, that's the wrong word. Oh my
mm.
gosh. Sorry, I haven't been teaching. It's been finals week. My brain's not working very well.
It's okay. It's okay.
It is really important to the canon. And I think one of the reasons why it's so important is because it really sets the foundation for learning how to analyze literature.
Mm,
F. Scott Fitzgerald was not shy in his writing about there being symbols of what things mean.
mm,
For example, the eyes that he talks about, the optometrist's eye sign, obviously like the eyes of people watching Gatsby and
mm,
Daisy, just being watched all around, having expectations of like your social status and
mm,
and also like with Gatsby's sort of mysterious nature, like the eyes, like the representation of just being watched
mm,
and being having these like layers of expectation placed on you. But I
mm.
just feel like The Great Gatsby, again, really common. I read it when I was in AP literature in high school. It
Okay.
really helped me learn how to analyze literature, find
Mm,
themes, find symbols, um looking at characterization and what the intentions of the characters are.
okay.
It's just a really really popular common book, and obviously it was made into the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio. So there are movie adaptations that you can
Mm,
watch. But yeah, I think that The Great Gatsby is a great book. It's not very long.
mm.
So
Okay. So those like main characters in the Great Gatsby, they're really extremely wealthy people. People
yes.
from like higher social hierarchies. Right?
Yes.
So my question is like how common? I mean, like as an average person, as an average reader in America, can you sympathize yourself with this particular group of people in the Great Gatsby, or are they just another group of people who are totally came from out of your league and they're like celebrities only exist in the TV and uh, can like so my question is can average person really like sympathize and like understand what goes on with these main characters?
I think the great thing about The Great Gatsby is that you just realize they're all terrible people. they're all just terrible humans. And
mm,
it's really, and obviously that's another part of the analysis,
mm.
is all of these people coming from these wealthy backgrounds and all of like the sort of drama that they have involving the movie, or not the movie, involving, again, their wealth, the expectations of their wealth, the movements between social classes, um what they consider to be like high class versus low class. And so as the average American, I couldn't relate to them at all. But because I couldn't relate to them, I think it made it easier for me to analyze them as characters. I
Oh,
think if I were to see myself in any of the
mm,
characters, if I saw myself in Daisy, or if I saw myself, in Gatsby, or in Tom Buchanan, and any of the main characters, I think it would be much harder for me to begin the analysis of the
mm,
characters,
mm,
just because it would sort of make me implicit.
mm,
Um, so while they weren't relatable characters at
mm.
all, it was much easier to separate myself from them and look at them with a more objective analytical lens.
Oh, interesting, interesting perspective. And as a as a Asian person, I think I'm influenced by like Confucianism. So
Yeah.
honestly speaking, I hate this book. I hate Great Gatsby. So main reason is because we have two couples inside this book, and this couple, they have a outside of marriage relationship, and
Hmm.
only for that fact I cannot agree with this book.
Hmm.
No matter how good, no matter how language that is fantastic in terms of literature. So with the same reason, I'm not sure if I should choose this book to share with our student to talk about this inappropriate relationship outside the marriage.
Right.
I but is in American school, in the schools in America, like I guess they teach Great Gatsby to students with no
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah. And I think, more than anything, one of the great things that I love about reading is that there's a constant exposure to ideas that I don't agree with.
Mm,
So when there are some books that I read that I absolutely hated. For example, I hate The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. I
mm,
hate it. I hate The Grapes of Wrath. I can't stand reading it.
mm,
It it drives me crazy.
mm,
Just because I'm not interested in the whole like movement across America, Dust Bowl, like I'm not interested in that. But
mm,
reading it also exposed me to a lot of different ideas that I never would have encountered because I don't have any interest in it. And so I understand what you're saying, is that it's definitely this idea of these rich people, and they're in committed relationships, but they have these like extramarital affairs, and it's definitely like highly sort of like questionable. It's definitely ethically immoral for a lot of people. However, it doesn't turn out very well for these characters in the end. And
mm,
so you can read into that in, are they being punished for being ethically immoral? Are they having their happiness taken away from them because they were cruel to their spouses and their significant others, because they did ignore these sort of like social expectations of what it is to be in a committed relationship? Did
mm,
they then suffer the consequences at the end? And ultimately, that's up for the reader to decide, And, I think with reading The Great Gatsby, you can have this idea continuously reaffirmed of not agreeing with extramarital relationships, and being like, okay, this is an ethical lesson on why, you need to be moral in your
mm.
relationships. And I think
Okay.
because I don't think it's as common to think about those things in America. I think that we are really exposed in a lot of our media, whether it be literature or book, literature or television or movies. There
Mhm,
are a lot of instances of extramarital affairs that
mm,
happen, and so I think it's much more common to see these sort of inappropriate relationships in American media than maybe it is in other cultures. And so I do not disagree with you being hesitant
mm.
on sharing this book with students,
Right.
especially students coming up in this culture. But I
Mm,
do think that it's important to be exposed to ideas that you don't agree with, so you can continue to build a foundation for why you don't agree with it. Otherwise, you can simply say, I don't agree with this. But if you don't know why you don't agree with it, therein lies sort of a problem.
right.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it totally makes sense. maybe I should try reading Great Gatsby one more time. Try to like prove with myself and give it
Well,
a shot.
maybe you can read it knowing that like they're all miserable, terrible people, and that wealth is just a facade in this
Mm,
novel. It's
mm,
just a facade.
mm,
Wealth is essentially the only thing that they have. None of
mm,
them are happy. None of them are fulfilled. None of them are satisfied. They're all confused. None of them are self aware. They have no communication skills whatsoever. So if you read it from the lens of all they have is this wealth, all they have is their fancy parties and their boats and their fancy clothes, but they're all miserable, then maybe it'll make it a bit easier to read it.
mm. So does that mean that Great Gatsby is like criticizing the materialism to some
I would
extent?
think so, because this is post World War One. So this is coming up on what I would define as like modernism in literature, which is it's like Gatsby is such a lonely character.
Mm,
And in modernism, you have this whole idea of alienation, separation from groups around you.
mm,
And after World War One, there are countries that are constantly trying to rebuild themselves, but then you've got the Roaring Twenties in America, where people are going to the speakeasies and they're drinking illegal alcohol, and they're like going to, like, again, to use the word fancy, going to all of these fancy parties. So I definitely think that you could read this from a
mm,
criticism of wealth, or a criticism of just using wealth poorly, which
mm.
again, as an American, would hold relevance for me in the current day and age if you want to be more political about
Oh,
it.
oh, hmm. I haven't thought it that way. I never thought like Great Gatsby is related to contemporary current issues, but
Oh
maybe.
well,
Mm,
I
okay.
mean, you would have to get a bit more in depth with American politics, but
Yes.
that's not the point of this interview
Right.
today.
Right.
So,
Point taken. Okay. Thank you. So, thank you. So let's move on to our next book, shall we?
yes,
So 1984. Would you like
one
to?
of my favorite books of all time, and
Really?
absolutely terrifying when looking at modern day society.
Mm,
One of the reasons why I love 1984, it was actually published in 1949 by George Orwell. Um, and obviously, a lot of people I think have read Animal Farm,
mm,
which is another one of his common books. I read Animal Farm, I think, when I was in high school as well. Again, another Animal Farm, another easy book if you want to start learning analysis and applying, literary theory.
mm.
Um, but 1984 is, I think, just one of the most relevant books that we could be
Wow.
reading right now.
Mm, mm,
Um, just not necessarily because of the idea of like totalitarianism, but the
mm,
idea of mass surveillance, the idea of developing this new way of speaking. If you think about the way that like younger people speak, the way that we share memes with each
mm.
other, the way that we speak in abbreviations,
Right.
I think anthropologists 100 years from now are going to be
Mm,
very confused about the way that we speak to each other, or
right.
our communication methods.
Mm,
And so while it's not the same as being forced to speak in another language, or knowing that we're being
mm,
sort of watched by the
mm,
eyes of Big Brother,
mm,
um we still do have we've developed a new way of speaking. We've
mm.
developed new ways of communicating, and we are being surveyed. We are being
Sure.
watched,
I
whether
agree.
that be through the GPS on our smartphones, or whether that be through
Mm,
CCTV when we step out of our doors.
right.
We are being watched.
Mm,
So
right. So when I think of 1984, novel is too gray, I should say, too gray and gloomy. So and little
very great.
rather monotonous. So I guess for 1984, it has some romance, but I'd prefer to read a book with a lot of like romance and sweet feelings and something like beautiful and sweet. But 1984 seems to be the opposite of like beautiful and like various. But still, it's quite amazing that some of our students still they are reading 1984 and talking
Yeah.
about this book. So I guess this
Um,
book.
none of the books, none of the pieces of literature that I chose are bright and happy. Most of them are pretty gloomy and sad. I don't know if you could tell a theme for my preferred media intake, but I definitely prefer the dark and the gloomy over the bright and the happy.
Oh, Mm.
It's just who I am as a person. But yeah, so I think that actually a lot of students are finding relevance in
Right,
1984.
right,
Um, and and I would
definitely.
agree with what you say. It is kind of a gloomy gray
Mm.
novel because he is trapped in this gloomy gray world
Word.
where everything needs to be the same. Everything
Mm.
needs to follow these rules.
Mm.
And I think it really contributes to the idea of how important developing your own sense of individualism is. You can
Mm.
still live in a community and still have your own ideas. You can still contribute to a community and still be an individual.
Mm.
And I think that this novel, it shows the sort of harmful side effects of what it is to sort of submit without knowing what you're submitting to
Mm.
and not really knowing why you do the things that you do. You're just terrified of not doing them.
Right.
And so, admittedly, I didn't read 1984 for the first time until like 3 years ago.
Mm.
I got through my whole undergraduate, I have a
Wow.
master's degree in English.
Wow.
I got through my whole undergraduate and graduate school without ever reading 1984.
Mm.
And when I read it for the first time, it was sort of shocking that
Oh,
I had
really?
gone so long without reading it, but that
Mm.
it wasn't more of uh, that it wasn't more of a big like wasn't a bigger deal in
Okay.
society right now just because there's so many parallel themes with like what is happening to us now and what Orwell was writing about.
Right, definitely. So
Yeah.
how did you come into contact with the book? Did you like voluntarily choose this book, or
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
years ago when you first read this book, oh, it's
Yeah.
your choice?
Yeah, so I actually, because I spent 7 years of university, my
Mm.
undergraduate and graduate school, just reading and writing. That's all I
Mm.
did because I was
Mm.
studying English the whole time.
Mm.
After I graduated, it took me a while to get back into reading again.
Mm.
I took a break from it just because I had done it so much for school and the joy and the
Sure,
pleasure of it
sure.
was gone.
Mm-hmm.
And
Sure.
then, I realized as I was talking with a couple of my friends, I realized that I hadn't read 1984.
Mm.
And so I was like, well, that is something that needs to happen. I need
Mm.
to read this book just
Mm.
because it comes up so frequently in conversations, especially political conversations now. It comes up so frequently. Um, but I feel like it's such a necessary part of
Mm.
a complete reading list.
Mm.
And I feel this way about certain authors. Orwell's one of them. I feel this way about Bradbury.
Mm.
I feel this way about, Philip K. Dick. I just don't think that certain reading lists are complete
Mm.
unless you've read specific books by
Right,
certain authors.
right, right.
So,
Mm.
yeah, I voluntarily chose this.
Okay, okay.
But I think that as we move further and further into a technological era where
Mm.
we do post so much of ourselves online, where we
Sure.
do allow so much of our lives to be seen,
Mm.
whether it be through Facebook or Instagram or like
Right.
even through something like Zoom, where you can
Mm.
see into people's houses, you can see into people's lives. I just feel like that this book, outside of being relevant to AP literature,
Mm.
is just a relevant book to read in general.
Sure, sure. And like Big Brother watching everyone is a really a huge idea inside the book. And also nowadays, for me, I guess the OR did a really good job how a government, how one government take advantage of the neighboring countries.
Right.
They make a really a good propaganda how neighbor countries are threatening Oceania all the time. So we have to like be prepared, and all the citizens have to listen to and comply for what the government is always saying or obey. And I guess he did a really good job of using the
Well,
neighboring countries.
and I think because it was published in 1949, again, it's a post-war book. It's a
Or
post-World War II book.
mm,
So we really are moving into modernism at
mm,
this point. And, looking at the propaganda that was used in World War II and the kind of propaganda that America used, against the Japanese forces, against the German forces,
right.
um,
Mm,
it's not really a surprise that Orwell would write about those things.
mm,
After seeing some of the propaganda and some of the way that like race was used negatively, where country of origin and how
sure.
like if you make a common enemy, how easy it is to control a country
Mm.
or how
And
easy it is to
media too. How easily media is manipulated by governments.
exactly. And how easily, if you look and you think about, the internet being
Sure.
monitored and watched, and
Yes.
certain, certain things not being able to be viewed in certain countries,
Sure.
even certain ideas of, like, for example, there's a video streaming service in America called Hulu. I can't get that in Korea. And so
Mm,
even something like that, knowing that, like, even these
mm,
certain streaming services that are
mm,
harmless are
mm.
being blocked from certain internet channels.
Oh,
How easily our media is manipulated and controlled.
true that.
And
Mm,
so while I agree that there are great things that
sure.
our government does, and that
Mm,
a lot of things our government does and keeps from us are to protect us, I think it is important that we remain aware that it is very
yes,
easy for
of
information
course.
to be altered and filtered.
Right.
And I think 1984 is a great example of that. And I really think it provides a foundation for this sort of like critical thinking and analysis when it
Mm,
comes to being aware of, like fake news, um, fake information, and just being really, really cognizant of where this information is coming from
right.
and how quickly we believe this information.
Sure. Right. Right. So yes, 1984 does have really so much implication for our current society. So great book. Great book.
It's a
Okay, I
great
guess
book.
shall I move to the next book?
Okay.
The Kite Runner. K- Uh, can
So,
you?
The Kite
Mm,
Runner, I actually cried my eyes out the
mm,
last 20 pages of this book.
mm,
Um, and it is just, I think the reason why I chose this is because it's one of the more contemporary books on the book list. It was actually published in 2003. So it's a much more modern book than Shakespeare, than Orwell, than Fitzgerald.
mm,
But one of the reasons why I think it's important is because the author is actually an Afghan American, and it takes place in Afghanistan. And so, for
mm,
people who might be unfamiliar with cultures of the Middle East,
mm-hmm.
I think that reading this book gives you a pretty interesting insight into the what's happened there, and what. So I think a lot of people have this idea of the Middle East, and what it
Sorry,
is.
sorry for interruption, but speaking of culture, Middle Eastern culture, that is
Yeah.
a that is exactly the reason why I didn't read this book. You know, this book looked too exotic and it looked
No,
quite too
it's so
super. Oh,
good.
really? Okay.
Yes.
Mm.
Oh, it's so good.
Oh, I
Oh,
see.
it's so good. It's
Mm.
so good. And it covers, I think, so many. I feel like the world as a whole really
Mm.
has a tendency to ignore the culture of the Middle East.
Mm.
Or we think of the Middle East and we think of it maybe as a. I know that as an American, the way that I view the Middle East when I was younger was
Mm.
definitely filtered and altered by a lot of the information that I was getting from the media at the
Sure.
time,
Yes.
especially in like a post 9/11 society. And
Sure.
so I think that reading books like this from Afghan authors, from Iraqi authors, from Iranian authors,
Mm.
people that come from the Middle East and actually can express their culture, can discuss their culture, can share
Right.
their culture. I
Mm.
think that that is a really, really important part of reading, and is going to be a very important part of our history moving forward. Um, I'm of the belief now that, ignorance of a culture is now, it's our responsibility to be aware and to learn about places that are beyond us.
Mm.
Even if we never visit these places, even if we never meet anyone from these
Mm.
areas, it is our sort of responsibility as a globalized society
Sure.
to learn about and be aware of other cultures.
Okay.
And I
So,
just,
sorry for interruption, but
no, it's okay.
if you summarize this book in one sentence, is it like a growing up novel, or is it like a romance novel? Is it like a friendship novel, or
I would
what?
say it is a coming of age story
Okay.
coupled with a story about a father son relationship,
Mm,
coupled with a shift in perspective.
okay.
But it's a lot of, it's almost like a history lesson that you get told through a fictional story.
About
But it is
Afghanistan.
yes, and it
Mm,
is a coming of age novel as well.
mm,
Um, because you are following I think his name is Amir. You are
Mm,
following Amir and, what he goes through as he grows up and the expectations of his culture and, his friendship that he has and the issues that come about, that happen in these friendships and in his relationships and what happens to his country. And it's heartbreaking.
okay.
But it's also just one of the best books I think I've ever read. This
Mm,
author himself, there's another book that he has called A Thousand Splendid Suns, and I was torn between which one to choose. But I think The Kite Runner, because it was the first book of his that I read, was life changing for me. It really was a game changer. And like you, Mr. Shin, sometimes I don't read certain books or I don't read
mm,
um, certain authors because I
mm,
worry that I won't
mm,
have the cultural perspective to understand, or because it seems too exotic, or
mm,
because, I worry that maybe I won't find it interesting, or my own cultural biases. But
mm,
this really changed the way that I approach books. And it
mm,
made me a lot more open to reading books from backgrounds that were very different from my own.
mm.
So,
So I think I kept you too long, Miss Larson. So I guess
no, not at all.
trying to wrapping up our video. One last question. One last question.
Of course,
Spoiler alert. Is a Kite Runner happy ending or sad ending?
that depends on what you find to be happy or sad. It's
Oh,
relative.
oh, wow.
Um,
Excellent.
I found it to be actually very inspiring.
Mm,
I was crying at the end just because it was so, you had come through so much with the story of this young man. Like you had like just endured so much with him. And then the very end, I just found it very inspiring. Um, and so for me, it was a happy ending. But some
okay.
people could view it, some people could read it and think that, oh, this is sad, or, but I thought it was a very empowering, inspiring ending,
Mm,
actually. And like I said, I loved reading this book, and I immediately went out and found other books that he had written, just because the writing is so detailed and it's just so beautiful. He's just such an excellent writer as
wow.
well.
Okay.
But also it's just so culturally educational,
Mm,
and just, I think, necessary. I think
okay.
absolutely necessary
Oh,
for people to be
wow. Oh,
exposed to something.
wow.
So
Okay.
I definitely think you should read this, Mr. Shin. You
Sure.
should read this book on your winter vacation.
Sure. Thank you. Sound very intriguing and exciting about this book.
Yeah,
And
it's great.
I think I kept you too long this time, and
I'm okay,
I
but
appreciate it.
of course.
Mm. So one last word to our student, please.
Um, I know that reading over winter vacation sounds like a bummer, but really, you should read at least one book over winter vacation.
Mm,
Especially because it'll keep your brain moving.
mm,
If you've made a lot of progress in language throughout this year, if
mm,
you've made a lot of progress when it comes to the speed that you read at, it would be a shame if you wasted the next 4 or 5 weeks not doing that. Keep that
mm.
progress, keep that momentum. Read. Reading is so good for you, especially for vocabulary development, because you will encounter words you've never seen before.
Mm. Okay.
Read over winter vacation. Do it.
Okay. Thank you, Kara. I'll keep that
Of
in mind,
course.
and I'll try to read some books during the week. Again, thank you. Thank you
Of
very much.
course.